The form of warfare used in the Great War had never been seen on such a large scale. Imagine a battlefield where the deafening sound of artillery never ceased, and the sky was constantly illuminated by explosions. The Battle of Verdun is a notable example of this devastation. On the first day of this hellish battle, German forces used 1,200 artillery guns and fired 2.5 million shells. To support this massive operation, 1,300 ammunition trains were mobilized, and the daily supply weight reached 25,000 tons. By the end of the battle, 14 million shells had been fired. One image that remained etched in the memory of many is a pile of shell casings, the remnants of the fired projectiles, stacked after a single day of combat. Each casing represented an explosion, an attempt to destroy the enemy, but also a reminder of the lives lost and the wounded during the conflict. The reason for so many casualties was partly due to the barrage tactic, a strategy devised by Sir Henry Horne during the Battle of the Somme in 1916. The technique involved slowly advancing artillery fire ahead of the advancing troops. It was a risky maneuver because if the timing of the shots was off, they could hit their own soldiers instead of the enemy. The tension in the air was palpable. Soldiers advancing on the battlefield knew the line between life and death was thin. They marched, trying not to think about the imminent danger, as explosions erupted around them, sending dirt and debris flying in all directions. Each step was a struggle against fear, each advance a victory against despair. As commanders observed from a distance, calculating the precision of the shots and adjusting coordinates, the soldiers on the ground knew that one mistake, one communication failure, could be fatal. At every moment, the hope of survival mixed with the brutal reality of war. The sight of the stacked casings was a silent testament to the scale of the destruction. With each new layer of twisted metal, the war exacted its toll, both in terms of resources and human lives. The land, once fertile, transformed into a field of death and desolation. The barrage technique, although effective, symbolized the relentless nature of war. It represented the attempt to impose order on chaos, to dominate the inferno. But the war, with its indiscriminate brutality, constantly reminded everyone that on the battlefield, certainty was an illusion and safety, a luxury. As the battle continued and night fell, the scene of destruction took on an even darker tone. The silhouettes of soldiers moved like shadows amidst the explosions, and the silence between the gunfire was filled with the cries of the wounded and the laments of those who lost their comrades. The hope of a new day brought with it the promise of more fighting, more challenges, and the ongoing struggle for survival. This was the reality of the Great War, a conflict where the scale of violence and technological innovation combined to create an unprecedented scene of destruction. As night enveloped the battlefield, the soldiers sought some relief in their makeshift shelters. The hastily dug and poorly protected trenches offered little protection against the cold and damp. Exhausted, the men huddled under their blankets, trying to ignore the distant sound of artillery that seemed never-ending. In the headquarters, the commanders studied maps by the flickering light of oil lamps. General Muller, his face marked by fatigue, analyzed the day's reports. He knew that the Battle of Verdun would be long and bloody, and each decision weighed heavily on his conscience. We need to maintain pressure on the enemy lines, he said, his voice grave and tired. But we can't afford to lose more men due to miscalculations. Tomorrow's barrage must be precise. Beside him, Captain Reinhardt nodded. He had seen the horrors of combat up close and understood the responsibility they bore. I'll make the necessary adjustments, sir. The men are ready, but morale is low. We need a victory to lift their spirits. Meanwhile, in the trenches, Soldier Hans watched the dark horizon. He gripped his rifle tightly, trying to push away thoughts of his family far away. Every minute felt like an eternity, and the waiting was almost unbearable. It feels like it will never end, doesn't it? His companion, Franz, said, trying to start a conversation to ease the tension. It feels like we're stuck in a never-ending nightmare. Hans sighed, looking up at the starry sky. I just hope it's all worth it. That one day we can go home and live in peace. Dawn brought with it a light fog that hung over the battlefield like a ghostly shroud. The soldiers prepared for another day of combat, adjusting their gear and checking their weapons. The sound of boots on wet earth was accompanied by the murmur of silent prayers and whispered farewells. At the decisive moment, the order was given. The artillery guns began to fire, launching shells that whistled through the air with a deadly sound. The barrage started its slow, relentless march, advancing bit by bit, preceding the soldiers who cautiously followed behind. Hans, his heart pounding, advanced with his platoon. Each explosion was a brutal reminder of the fragility of life. They moved in unison, each man aware of the danger surrounding them. "Stay together," shouted the sergeant, trying to keep the formation cohesive. "Don't stop for anything." But the chaos was uncontrollable. In the midst of the advance, a closer explosion lifted dirt and debris, throwing Hans to the ground. Dazed, he tried to get up, feeling a throbbing pain in his leg. Looking around, he saw fallen comrades and heard cries of agony filling the air. The sergeant ran to him, pulling him into an improvised shelter. "Hans, are you okay?" he asked, eyes full of concern. "I'll be fine, Sergeant." "Just need a moment," Hans replied, fighting against the pain and fear. The battle raged on, merciless, and every soldier knew the day would be long and full of challenges. Despite his injury, Hans was determined to continue, driven by the hope that their struggle would not be in vain. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe to our War Stories channel. Here, we share detailed analyses, the latest news, and inspiring stories from the world of warfare. Your participation is essential to us, and together we can celebrate every advance and overcome every challenge. Let's continue following this exciting journey and rooting for more unforgettable moments on the battlefield. The afternoon dragged on slowly, marked by a series of gunfire exchanges and explosions. The artillery never ceased, and the deafening noise forced the men in the trenches to shout to communicate. With each advance, the enemy line drew closer, and the tension in the air became almost tangible. Hans, with the sergeant's support, managed to pull himself together and return to the fight. His hands trembled, but he gripped his rifle firmly, determined to press on. Beside him, Franz was quieter than usual, focused on each step he took. Suddenly, an urgent order echoed through the trenches: "Retreat! Retreat!" The enemy had launched an unexpected counteroffensive, catching everyone off guard. Hans and the other soldiers quickly began to move back, trying to avoid the heavy fire now directed at them. As they retreated, Hans felt a violent impact on his back. He fell to the ground, his body stunned by the pain. Franz, realizing what had happened, ran to him. "Hans! Hans, stay with me," he shouted, trying to drag his friend to a safer spot. Shells continued to explode around them, and the ground seemed to shake with each impact. Desperate, Franz managed to get Hans behind an improvised barricade. "Hold on, my friend. You're going to be okay," he said, his voice choked with emotion. Hans tried to smile, but the pain was intense. "Thank you, Franz. Don't leave me here," he whispered, feeling his strength waning. Meanwhile, at the headquarters, General Muller received news from the front lines. "Sir, we're being pushed back. We need reinforcements immediately," a messenger said, his face pale with worry. Muller nodded, aware of the gravity of the situation. "Send everything we have. We can't lose this position," he ordered, trying to stay calm. He knew the Battle of Verdun was crucial and that every soldier counted. Back on the front line, reinforcements began to arrive. Hans and Franz, exhausted and wounded, watched as their comrades advanced to contain the enemy offensive. The sergeant, seeing Hans's condition, called for a medic. "This man needs immediate help," he said, his voice firm but tinged with urgency. The medic arrived quickly, beginning to treat Hans's wounds. "You're strong," "You'll survive this," he said, trying to comfort him. Franz held Hans's hand, trying to convey some strength. "You're going to make it, Hans. We'll go home together," he promised, his eyes filled with determination. The battle raged on, relentless. The soldiers fought with everything they had, each one aware that survival depended not only on their skills, but also on their courage and their comrades. As night fell, the fighting intensified. The flashes of gunfire and explosions lit up the sky, creating an almost surreal scene. Hans, now more stable after the medic's care, watched everything around him. He knew the war was merciless, but he also knew he had something to fight for, the hope of a better future. In the trench, Franz stayed close to Hans, continuing to fire at the enemy. The unity and camaraderie among the soldiers were palpable, each one willing to risk everything for the other. If you found this story moving, please like and subscribe to our War Stories channel. Here, we share detailed analyses, the latest news, and inspiring stories from the world of warfare. Your participation is essential to us, and together we can celebrate every advance and overcome every challenge. Let's continue following this captivating journey and hoping for more unforgettable moments on the battlefield. As the night wore on, the biting cold intensified in the trenches of Verdun. The darkness was broken only by the sporadic flashes of gunfire and explosions. Hans, still recovering from his injuries, felt each breath as a victory. Franz, beside him, kept a vigilant watch, his eyes fixed on the enemy line, alert to any movement. "We need to hold on a bit longer," Franz murmured, not taking his eyes off the horizon. "The reinforcements are here, and our front line is regrouping." Hans nodded, feeling the pain gradually subside. "Do you think we can make it?" he asked, his voice weak but determined. "We have to believe that," Franz replied, squeezing his friend's shoulder. "Each of us makes a difference. And you've already done more than your share today." The distant sound of a bugle signaled a new advance by the Allied troops. The soldiers rose with renewed determination, ready to push the enemy back. The sergeant barked orders, organizing the men for the next assault. Across the line, General Muller studied the maps and reports. The battle was fierce, but he knew their resistance was working. "And we need to keep up the pressure. We can't give in," he told his officers, his voice firm but tinged with concern. At the front line, Hans and Franz prepared for another assault. The medic returned, giving Hans a fresh bandage. "You'll need this. Don't give up now," he said before moving on to tend to other wounded men. Minutes turned into hours, and the Battle of Verdun raged on relentlessly. Every meter of ground gained was fiercely contested, with men falling and rising again, driven by hope and desperation. Franz, now beside Hans, saw an opening. Come on, we need to take advantage of that gap," he shouted, pointing to a less defended spot in the enemy line. Hans, adrenaline pumping, nodded and followed his friend. They advanced, each step a struggle against fear and exhaustion. Other soldiers joined them, forming an improvised but determined line. The sound of gunfire and explosions was deafening, but within the chaos, Hans found a clear focus: survive and protect his comrades. As they fought, the figure of an enemy officer emerged through the fog. He was coordinating a counterattack, and his presence was an obvious target. Hans and Franz exchanged a quick glance, understanding what needed to be done. With renewed determination, they moved toward the officer. The battle around them seemed to fade as they ran. Every bullet, every explosion seemed secondary. The enemy officer saw them and tried to retreat, but it was too late. With a combination of precise shots and unbridled courage, Hans and Franz neutralized him, causing a temporary disarray in the enemy ranks. Taking advantage of the confusion, the Allied soldiers advanced, gaining precious ground. Hans, exhausted but triumphant, looked at Franz, and they both understood the impact of their actions. We did it," Hans said with a weary smile. Franz laughed despite the tension. We still have a lot to do, but we're on the right track. In the rear, General Muller received news of the advance. We're turning the tide. Keep up the pressure, he ordered, feeling a glimmer of hope amid the despair of war. The Battle of Verdun still had much to reveal, with anonymous heroes emerging at every moment. Hans, Franz, and their comrades knew each day could be their last, but that only strengthened their resolve to fight for every inch of land, every life saved, and every hope kept alive. The early morning brought a brief silence, a pause in the storm of fire and blood. The men in the trenches took deep breaths, preparing for what was to come. The first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, casting a pale glow on the devastated battlefield. Hans and Franz, covered in mud and blood, looked around, assessing the damage from the previous night. The silence was oppressive, a tense calm before the next storm. What do you think today holds for us? Hans asked, his voice rough from exhaustion and continuous strain. More of the same, I imagine, Franz replied, trying to stretch his sore muscles. But at least we managed to advance a bit. That's already a victory. As the soldiers prepared for another day of combat, General Muller gathered his officers for an urgent meeting. We've received intelligence that the enemy is planning a major attack at dusk. We need to prepare for a robust defense and counterattack with everything we've got, Muller said, his voice firm. However, the morale of the men was low. The losses had been heavy, and the exhaustion was evident on their faces. Muller knew he needed a plan that could inspire them to keep fighting. Our scouts reported a potential weakness in the enemy line, Muller continued, pointing to a detailed map of the area. If we can breach this gap, we can cut their supply line and gain a crucial advantage. Hans and Franz, now rested, were among the soldiers chosen for the mission to recon the weak point. We need sharp eyes and brave hearts for this task, Muller said, looking directly at them. You two have shown extraordinary courage. We trust you. With a mix of pride and apprehension, Hans and Franz prepared for the mission. Each step was a careful dance among the debris, avoiding mines and traps left by the enemy. The tension was palpable as they approached the area indicated by the scouts. As they neared the enemy line, they spotted the breach. It was a poorly defended section of the trench, with tired soldiers and scarce resources. Hans gestured to Franz, indicating they should proceed with caution. We can do this, Hans. They're not expecting it, Franz whispered, his eyes gleaming with determination. Moving quickly and silently, they slipped through the breach, neutralizing the few guards they encountered. They infiltrated deep into the enemy line, observing the depots of ammunition and essential supplies. This could change everything, Hans murmured, his hands trembling with adrenaline. Suddenly, a noise behind them made them freeze. They turned, ready to fight, but found a young enemy soldier, no older than 16, staring at them with wide, frightened eyes. He held a weapon, but it was clear he didn't know how to use it. Hans and Franz exchanged a look. They knew they couldn't leave any witnesses, but they also couldn't bring themselves to kill a terrified young boy. Go back and tell your superiors we're here, Hans said in a firm but non-threatening tone. He warned them to surrender, or face the consequences. The boy ran off, leaving Hans and Franz alone. They knew they had little time before the alarm was raised. We need to get back and inform General Muller, Franz said, pulling Hans by the arm. With hearts pounding, they made their way back to their lines, crossing the battlefield with a mix of urgency and caution. When they finally reached command, they were met by Muller and his officers. We found the breach and the supply depots, Hans said, breathing heavily. But they know we're there. We need to act fast. Muller nodded, his mind already working on strategies. You two did an excellent job. Prepare to lead the attack. This might be our chance to turn the tide. As preparations for the attack began, Hans and Franz exchanged a glance, feeling the weight of responsibility. They knew that the next move could decide the fate of many men. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation and determination, as the soldiers readied themselves for what could be the decisive battle. The sun began to rise higher on the horizon, casting a golden light over the devastated battlefield. The troops were ready, waiting for the signal to advance. Hans and Franz, at the front of the platoon, felt the adrenaline coursing through their veins. They knew this attack could change the course of the war. General Muller approached, his expression serious but confident. Remember, men, we are fighting for our survival. The breach that Hans and Franz found is our chance. Let's seize this opportunity and show the enemy what we are made of. With a nod, Muller gave the signal. The troops began to advance, moving with determination and precision. The sound of boots on the dry ground and the clamor of weapons ready for battle filled the air. Hans and Franz led the charge, their minds focused and their bodies on high alert. As they approached the breach, they encountered little initial resistance, just as they had predicted. The enemy soldiers, caught off guard, began to retreat. "We're almost there," Hans shouted, encouraging his men to keep going. Franz was right behind, covering the flanks and ensuring no one was left behind. When they finally reached the supply depots, Hans and Franz coordinated the destruction of the enemy reserves. Explosions echoed across the field, signaling that the mission was being successfully carried out. However, the joy was short-lived. The enemy, now aware of the attack, began to counterattack with full force. A fierce battle ensued, with gunfire and explosions filling the air. Hans and Franz fought bravely, leading their troops with courage and determination. After hours of intense combat, the enemy began to retreat. Victory was near, but not without a high cost. The battlefield was strewn with debris and wounded men, the cruel price of war. With the enemy finally in retreat, Hans and Franz allowed themselves a moment of relief. General Muller approached, his eyes reflecting both exhaustion and pride. "You did an incredible job. Today, we took a big step towards victory." Hans, with a determined look, replied, "It was a team effort. Every man here gave his all. We will keep fighting until this war is over." As the men gathered to tend to the wounded and count the survivors, there was a renewed sense of hope. The battle had been won, but the war was not yet over. However, with each victory, peace seemed a little closer. And so ends the story of Hans, Franz, and their comrades in the Great War. A tale of courage, sacrifice, and determination, reminding us of the high costs of war and the unwavering hope of those who fight for peace. If you enjoyed this moving story and want to hear more inspiring tales of courage and bravery, don't forget to like and subscribe to our War Stories channel. Here, we share incredible accounts of past battles, honoring the memory of those who gave everything for a better future. Your participation is essential to keep the memory of these heroes alive. Let's continue this journey together, learning more about the past to build a future of peace.